I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
Peace. Brother Omawale Clay from the December 12th movement. We came here today to announce that there is a humanitarian crisis in Zimbabwe. This crisis is a direct result of the Trump administration's extension of sanctions on the economy and people of Zimbabwe. We came here to announce that this Saturday, May 25th, there will be a march on African Liberation Day to the White House to demand that the Trump administration lift the sanctions on Zimbabwe. It is toward that end and that demand that we're also moving to tell the Congressional Black Caucus that they must publicly support the demand of direct negotiations between the government of the United States and the government of Zimbabwe. Negotiations that will be fair and just to arrive at a resolution to lift these humanitarian crisis sanctions. We also want the Congressional Black Caucus to investigate the harm that is being done to the people of Zimbabwe by these sanctions. And towards that end, we ask them to invite members from the government of Zimbabwe to come to Congress to testify on the impact of these sanctions. We also ask them to reevaluate the election that was recently held in Zimbabwe that once again brought the People's Party, ZANU-PF, to the leadership of Zimbabwe and its new president, Edward Mnangagwa, and their new second republic. And to understand that that election was sanctioned and verified by many observers around the world, except the West, that these were free and fair elections. Also, we want it clear and made known that we stand with the Zimbabwean people on asking for legitimate negotiations. But we stand with Zimbabwe and their resistance to the imposition of intimidation. This is a new day. Africans have been the victims of international crimes against humanity by the West. And therefore, we have the right to enter as independent and sovereign countries. Africans have the right to negotiate on the same basis of other countries around the world. Intimidation is not and cannot replace legitimate and fair negotiations that take place everywhere. The Zimbabwean government is ready and willing to sit down with the U.S. government to discuss the resolution of their conflicts. But this cannot be done with intimidation. It cannot be done with a move for regime change, where no matter what the Zimbabwean people do, it is not good enough to the former colonizers because it does not return the land that was stolen by them back into their hands. That will never happen. The land reclamation program is irreversible. The land that was taken back to the Zimbabwean people will never be reversed. And so therefore, we want to make this statement to the people. Come out, 12 o'clock, Saturday, May 25th. We will assemble right here on this plaza, a historical plaza, where Africans in the Civil War fought for their own freedom. No one gave it to them. And now we want to hear from one of the foremost international human rights lawyers, one of our attorneys, Attorney Roger Warehead.
Good afternoon. It's important for people to understand that the United States imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe nearly 20 years ago. The so-called Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, signed into law, proposed by the notorious racist senator from North Carolina, Jesse Helms, and co-sponsored by then Senator Hillary Clinton, provided a legal basis for illegal sanctions. Zimbabwe was being and is being punished for exercising its right to self-determination. The Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act and the amendment to the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which was signed into law by President Trump just a week after Zimbabwe held elections in 2018, continue that policy of illegal sanctions. These are violations of international law. These are violations of the United Nations Charter. It's the interference by a country in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. Everyone recognizes that except the United States. So that's why we are here to demand that the United States recognize international law, that the United States observe international law, that the United States is not an entity unto itself above international law, and that President Trump and the administration lift the sanctions, begin negotiations with the government of Zimbabwe, which over the past year and a half has engaged in several strides to demonstrate that democracy has been restored. Democracy was never an issue in Zimbabwe. The elections that occurred in July of 2018, I was part of an observer team there. The elections were conducted in a manner which were fair and free. All parties were there at each of the polling stations to participate and to demonstrate that it was fair and free. And in fact, the elections in Zimbabwe are fairer and freer than what happens here in the United States. So we want to reiterate that what's happened, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act and its amendment are violations of international law. That the United States, no matter what it says, is subject to that and needs to observe that. Thank you.
This is our sister Iman Essayet of our youth committee and part of the Friends of Zimbabwe in December 12th.
And let us be clear that the sanctions on Zimbabwe are being used as a weapon of mass destruction. Again, the sanctions on Zimbabwe are being used as a weapon of mass destruction, all because the Zimbabwean people dared to do what no other African country has ever done, and that is liberate themselves and take back the land that the European colonizers have stolen from them. And because of this, the United States wants to place immoral sanctions upon Zimbabwe, and we must think about the millions and millions of people whose lives are being destroyed because of the immoral sanctions. Medical supplies are not being allowed into the country. They're not able to trade, and their economy is being attacked because of these sanctions, and the development of the people is being destroyed. So we must take a stand. That is why we are calling on the CBC to take a position. The Congressional Black Caucus must take a position when we are talking about our brothers and sisters on the continent. Their lives are being destroyed because of the immoral sanction. Millions and millions of youth lives are being destroyed. I saw a few months ago that they wanted to talk about this whole issue of Bronclear, which is a drug that the youth are turning to, and they're turning to this to suppress the oppression caused by the sanctions. So if we are really human beings, and if we really are black people who want to fight for the liberation of black people, then we must take a stand, and we must fight for the lifting of the immoral sanctions that are being placed on a people who dared to liberate themselves. And they have a right to be self-determined. They have a right because they are a sovereign nation.
Next we'll hear from Brother Salim Adolfo, the chair of the DC chapter of the National Black United Front.
Greetings. Thank you all for the opportunity to come and speak on behalf of the National Black United Front, as well as District ACO7, which I've been elected to be commissioner of. The fight in Zimbabwe is the same fight that's going on here, for a fight of self-determination, self-respect, and self-defense of our community. We must be able to connect with some of the younger folks on the ground here to get them to understand that our struggle is an international struggle. The same things that they're doing over there to them, they're doing over here to us, and vice versa. And until we can get that connection with our young people here to understand that they have a responsibility to our ancestors and to our elders continue on this legacy, then we'll have a generation that's lost. This just did not happen a couple of days ago, brothers and sisters. This just didn't happen last week when the first African was kidnapped and taken hostage and brought to America. That's when this fight began. And these sanctions are a continuation of that. Our sisters and brothers need to be able to have the right to self-determination. They need to be able to have the right national domestic product, to be able to do trade and commerce without the sanctions of the United States prohibiting that. They need to be able to build their own institutions. And until we can get the Congressional Black Caucus to be on the ground and stand in solidarity with our sisters and brothers, we'll have to continue to come out here and fight all the time, every day, and keep pounding the pavement and go door to door and talk to our sisters and brothers and get them to understand that we must organize, we must organize, we must organize. And if we're going to have elected officials need to be here in support of their sisters and brothers, not just here, but also abroad, because this struggle is an international struggle. The reason why we're able as elected officials to be in this position is because of the fight that sisters and brothers had, not just here, but worldwide. And that connection was definitely made strong by one of our strongest ancestors, Brother Malcolm X, who showed us the connection between the international struggle and the local struggle. So I'm encouraging all our sisters and brothers to get on social media, to spread this word, and to be out here. If we want to put something on Snapchat and Instagram, let's make sure we put that we want the Congressional Black Caucus to stand up against the sanctions against Zimbabwe, and to tell the Trump administration that we want to organize and we want to sit down and have some negotiations on behalf of the sisters and brothers in Zimbabwe. Thank you.
We'll now take questions from the media that's present.
Go ahead, yeah.
What's the game plan as far as approaching Representative Bass, given that she's the leader of the CBC? At any time in this protest, is there any consideration of perhaps going up there to her office and talking to her or a staff member?
Yeah, absolutely. This press conference was in fact to announce a plan and a strategy to bring our communities together and certainly point the CBC towards these unfair, illegal, and anti-human sanctions that are being put on Zimbabwe. And so the leadership of the CBC, those dealing with foreign policy, those dealing with other issues of domestic policy, we want to organize them and first educate them. That's why one of our demands is you can't make policy, you can't pass legislation or rebuke legislation unless you have the information, which is why one of our demands for the CBC is that they call members of the Zimbabwe government to come and have hearings and let them ask the people of Zimbabwe what's going on. Let them explain what the nature of sanctions are. Sometimes we don't control our own communities and don't really understand what sanctions actually do and how insidious they are. It denies a country its ability in terms of international trade. It manipulates the currency of a country to devalue it. It also comes at things that you don't really necessarily think of. The supply of chemicals, fertilizer, medical supplies, the cholera epidemic that went on in Zimbabwe. They never had cholera in Zimbabwe. But not only was it a direct result of being hindered from the products that in terms of take care of sanitation, but now that cholera is there, the medical supplies to treat people. These are all insidious attacks on the people. And so the CBC, yes, we're going to step to the CBC. We've stepped to the CBC before, but after 2 decades of sanctions against Zimbabwe, the people of Zimbabwe are a shining example of what unity does. Because in spite of all of the blows Zimbabwe has endured, in spite of all of the insidious ways that they want to deal with regime change, Zimbabwe is an example of the kind of unity we need to have in our community, the kind of unity we need to have with our legislators. And we need to come back in the spirit of Ron Dellums, the spirit of Charles Diggs, that, you know, we have to have a policy for black people at home and abroad that speaks to our unity. One of the greatest weapons that Steve Biko said was that to have the mind, the oppressor, have your mind in his hands. That's one of the greatest. Yes, so we will be talking to the CBC. Yes, sis.
Peace and Black Power. My name is Jay Arundel. I'm here representing Fly Nubian Queen Network, the network for melanated women and men like you. I have a lot of people, our people don't know about these sanctions. And thank you for going in and explaining exactly what sanctions do. But I want to know the impact that these sanctions, these illegal sanctions on Zimbabwe are having on the continent of Africa as a whole and the diaspora as a whole.
Well, one of the things that the sanctions have done has been the fact that Zimbabwe's economy at one time, and let me give you an example. When I first went to Zimbabwe, and it was 1999, $1 US was to 37 Zim dollars. They destroyed the Zimbabwe financial system. And one point in time, $1 was almost worth 10 million Zim dollars, and then it was to destabilize the country, where they had to shift over to the US dollar, in fact, to stabilize the economy. And so the impact that has ripples effect around the rest of Africa in terms of their unity and currency. The other question is, the very important one, is what's happening in South Africa right now. In South Africa right now, land is on the agenda. In Namibia right now, land is on the agenda. Africa, 90% of the people in Africa are in the rural areas. 90% of the people in Africa are dealing with agriculture and stuff. So land is fundamental to development. In fact, the World Bank recently came out with a report that it is impossible for a developing country to develop without being in control of its land. They didn't want to say Zimbabwe's correct in taking back their land, but they knew economically, how can you develop? And so in Africa, they want to try to destroy Zimbabwe to send a message to South Africa that, you know what, if you're going to deal with land reclamation, it's going to be on our terms. And what terms can they be when somebody comes to your country and takes not only the land for resources and agriculture, but culture? Because culture comes off of the land. So it's not just a question of taking the land, it's to destroy the culture, because culture is the basis of our resistance.
But also, it has an effect in the immediate region. So the damage that's done to Zimbabwe has an effect, because Zimbabwe is part of a region called the South African Development Community. And they have projects that they get funded for, get help for, that Zimbabwe is a part of. But because Zimbabwe cannot participate in the international market, anyone that tries to develop through the international market, through the banking system, gets knocked out by the United States. So it not only restricts Zimbabwe, but it undercuts the work that SADC's trying to do to develop as a community, because SADC is a reflection of understanding that eventually Africa is one, it's a continent, and it needs to be working together. These regional conferences are examples of that. So it has concrete effect in terms of undermining what SADC is doing in terms of regional development.
Jared Ball, mix what I like. I'm wondering if anybody could speak more to the connection between specifically Black America and this issue with Zimbabwe and the continent. In other words, why should DC residents or anybody else, Africans in this country, be concerned? Because a lot of people are going to see this and be like, what does it have to do with us?
I would like to say that as we see here in DC, we're from New York, but in DC the same thing is happening, the ethnic cleansing of our community. And we need to see that it's the same fight here that we have here, because we're being ethnically cleansed in our communities, and that's what happened in Zimbabwe. They came and they tried to take their land and stuff like that, but the Zimbabweans fought with armed struggle and self-determination and took back their land. So we must see Zimbabwe as the example, because we are being moved on here in America. Clearly we know that America was built on the backs of Black people. So we need to be clear on that, see Zimbabwe as the example, and see how the sanctions are the same example of the oppression that we face every single day here in the United States. Us getting shot down in the streets, them putting lead in our water, us being miseducated. It's the same oppression done by the same hand. The same hand that has the sanctions on Zimbabwe is the same hand that is oppressing us here in America. So we must stand together as one united Black nation.
So specifically, what I think is also important, in addition to what was previously said, is that this is Washington, D.C. There are a lot of sisters and brothers from the continent that are here, a lot of sisters and brothers who are going to be here from Zimbabwe. And so what we see in terms of DACA, a lot of folks being deported, a lot of the immigration issues are important, because we have a lot of people who identify as Zimbabwe Americans. And those sanctions directly impact them. And the sisters and brothers here in D.C. have to work with some of these sisters and brothers. They may be friends with some of them, they may go to school with them. And to see somebody snatched up out of your classroom that you're working on a project with, this has the conversation sometimes is real broad, but in terms of specifics and how it impacts you in the day-to-day life, your next door neighbor, somebody who may be somebody that you go to school with, that you go to church with, could be somebody from Zimbabwe, and that person could end up be just snatched up and thrown in a concentration camp somewhere, and then their children could be on the other side of the country somewhere. So we see those kinds of things that are happening. But more specifically, that we should also take into consideration that the same things that are done in other places, that are tried and tested in other places, are done here to us. And we don't have that relationship. We say, okay, well, that's just them over there. No, it's never just them over there. It might be them today, but it might be us tomorrow. And that's the thing that we have to understand. But most importantly, also being here in the United States capital city, the citadel of white supremacy, we have to be the vanguard for our sisters and brothers abroad. They're looking at us to be able to take a stand in a position because we are right here. If we don't do it right here, no, I'm not talking about New York, Chicago, LA, I'm talking about right here in Washington, D.C. We have a responsibility to be on the forefront, to be in these spaces that they can't be. It takes resources to get from here to LA or from Nebraska to here. So we got to be on the front lines for our sisters and brothers and be able to speak for our people on the international level right here, be the conduit for that information.
The other thing I was going to say was, and I think this is very important for our brothers and sisters, DC, New York, around the country to see. Zimbabwe is an instruction for us. It's an instruction in organization, commitment, and the will to win. The Zimbabwean people fought Chimarangas. They're shown a word for war. Their war of liberation not only defeated the colonists, but also they had to fight a civil war to build internal unity in the country. They came out of that. Then they came to the question, if people remember, for 10 years, they had a willing selling, willing buyer. The West, as they always lie, said, we will compensate you for the land so it could be paid for. That was a lie. For 10 years, they sat on that peacefully. Willing selling, willing buyer, the money to pay the white farmers for the land. Not the improvements, the land itself. They reneged on that. The people of Zimbabwe said, we did not go to war. We did not fight a national liberation war for a parliament. We fought it for our land. And so therefore they set out on the question of land reclamation and they took it back. And the people in the government and their unity returned millions of hectares of land to the people. There's a lesson there. That means there's no perfect straight line. There's internal contradictions. There's struggle, there's conflict. But the People's Party, ZANU-PF, has led the Zimbabwean people along a journey. And right now, they're as unified and as strong as ever. It is perseverance these 2 decades have kept the people from not falling to sanctions and regime change. We're part of the Zindira Zimbabwe Democracy Act is to support the buildup of an opposition to make their economy scream and make the people beg for a different leadership and a different land policy. The people have resisted that because of the journey of organization, the journey of a party. Those are the lessons for us. The lessons of how do you build unity? How do you resolve conflict? How do you struggle to come out of it stronger than you went into it? Those are the lessons for us in DC. Those are the lessons for us in New York. Those are the lessons across the black diaspora of building unity. That's the greatest weapon we have, is unity.
We're here in the African American Civil War Veterans Museum. That exposes a lie. That history exposes a lie that black people did not resist. We fought for our freedom from slavery. It was not given to us. It was not handed down by Abraham Lincoln. We fought for that. So that's part of us dispelling the lie that keeps us feeling that we're obligated to white folks. Zimbabwe similarly dispels the lie of the fact that African people do not resist, do not assert their independence, do not stand up to colonialism and imperialism. And it's for all the reasons that these comrades have talked about, it's important for us to understand what Zimbabwe means and what it means for us here in terms of inspiration. It is a reciprocal struggle between what we do here and what goes on in the continent. All of the people who fought for liberation in the continent spoke about the inspiration that the black liberation struggle provided for them. The example is set. And so now we must draw on that in terms of our conditions here.
We want people to send a message out that this African Liberation Day, Saturday, May 25th at 12 o'clock, we will assemble at this historic spot, a spot that is also under attack. Because as they try to ethnically cleanse our neighborhood, how long can institutions that reflect our history last? So we say off the sidewalk, into the streets. 12 o'clock, the African American Civil War Museum at the Plaza. This is where we'll be Saturday, May 25th. We want that word to go out.
I did just have one more question. If any of you or more than one of you can speak to the history briefly of African Liberation Day and the context of that and its relationship to this?
A number of years ago, particularly when many of the African countries were still under colonialism, Brother Owusu Sadoki led a team of brothers and sisters from New York to go and visit the liberated areas in Mozambique. Of course, they couldn't actually be taken into the liberated areas because the fighting was going on. But they asked the brothers and sisters in Frelimo, what can we do to support you? They said, take the message back to the people in the United States. Let them know the battle that we're fighting. Let them know that we need their moral, political, and financial support. And they came back and they had a meeting in Frogmore, South Carolina, where they came together and said on 1972, May 27th, 1972, we will organize an African Liberation Day. It coincided with African Liberation Day on the continent, and that was the first one. And I think over 60,000 brothers and sisters came from all over the United States to make that significant statement. And from that statement came, and in San Francisco, there was another demonstration. There was one in the Caribbean in a few places, one in even Canada in a few places. But it was really the struggle to heighten the unity between African people. And from that came the African Liberation Support Committee. And during that support committee, brothers made material support, gave material support to brothers and sisters on the continent, to Frelimo, to PAIGC, to MPLA, to ZANU-PF and ZAPU was in the field fighting, to the ANC, the PAC. The struggle was send the weapons, send the resources and finances to help them win liberation. And so therefore, we're looking at the benefit of that. We're looking at African countries that sought and got political independence. But as we see in Zimbabwe, and as Kwame Nkrumah said, seek ye first the political kingdom, and then must follow the economic kingdom. Because if the economic kingdom does not follow, the political kingdom cannot survive. And so we see the recolonization of our communities, the recolonization in Africa. And Zimbabwe stands as a fortress against that. A fortress. It's their land. It's their land. It's their land. And it was stolen. All they did was correct history. And for that, they're being punished. They're being punished daily. And I don't want to minimize, as the sister asked, what sanctions actually do. Because they're the atomic bomb and hydrogen bomb of the West. If you're a colonized country seeking now to develop, chart your own course as a sovereign nation, if the West attacks you and denies you international trade, that is a crime against humanity. If they deny you medicine, a crime against humanity. And the things that were stolen from those countries that they benefited from, they want to act like they belong to them. They don't. And so the lessons are very powerful. And I'm glad you asked. The history of African Liberation Day is something that we can never let touch the ground. We're an African people. We're an African people. And at the speech that Owusu said at the end, we are an African people. Straight ahead.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.